May 29th of this year saw the release of the definitive edition of Xenoblade Chronicles for the Switch. For many, it was a great way to revisit a beloved RPG classic. For me, it was a second chance at a game that I'd spent many years in conflict over. But to begin explaining this personal odyssey of mine, some background is needed. The official Nintendo magazine, ONM for short, served as my gateway to a wider world of gaming way back in 2011. Christmas and birthday lists soon became lined with games they praised highly, some of what became all-time favourites in fact. One of the very first titles that I saw them admire heavily throughout many pages, throughout many issues, was Xenoblade Chronicles, a game which I never would have heard of otherwise. Due to their acclaim of this game, I of course wanted to play it, but due to it being in short supply, it wouldn't be about until 2013, I think, that I would finally get my hands on a copy. And having also purchased a Pro Controller purely for this game, I sat down ready to embark on an incredible RPG adventure. And I eventually sold it after being stuck on the same bit for a good while. At the time, I just decided I didn't like it. A couple of years later, I gave the follow-up Xenoblade Chronicles X a try, which I had for even less time before selling it. Okay, so you're all probably thinking, fine, he just doesn't get the appeal of this series, why am I even watching this video? Well, I had little qualms about giving up on X, but the original was different. There were things I loved about it during my short time playing it, and I mean loved. So as more time passed, I couldn't help but wonder if had I persevered through the roadblock I'd hit, I'd be as entranced by it as I hoped I would when I first popped the disc in. So that's where the Switch version and the purpose of this video comes in. But before we see how my opinion has changed, we should start with why I originally gave up on it in the first place. Now, if you've never played it, you might be thinking the game starts off slow like the majority of RPGs. But actually, no, the game opens really well as we're introduced to the rather unique setting of two giant beings frozen in an eternal battle, the Bionis and the Mechonis. The action begins on the Bionis as we see the inhabitants of both behemoths carry on the war that their homes began, and it's exciting right off the bat. After that opening, we cut to a year later where we meet Shulk, a plucky scientist studying a mysterious weapon called the Monado, which was wielded by his good friend Dunban in that first scene. We're also introduced to Shulk's best friend Ryan and Dunban's sister Fiora, and now it's time to do some menial quests. Okay, is this the point where I ducked out? No, it's a fun introduction to the world and characters. Some other genre games bore a little in this regard, but I have no problem with the first few missions here. The point at which I did leave the game previously is during the story's inciting incident, which sees the peaceful Colony 9 fall under attack from the evil Mechon and forces Shulk to use the Monado for himself for the first time. And this was where I really struggled with the combat system, because you have to perform certain moves in a certain order to damage the boss Mechons, which I don't think came off very clearly in the Wii version. However, the definitive edition adds the extremely helpful new feature that lets you know when and which attack, or arts I should say, are going to deal critical damage. That alone was a lifesaver, and it really helped me in getting through that bit and finally allowing me to properly begin this adventure. It's a revenge story with Shulk hellbent on avenging those lost in the attack on Colony 9, so he and Ryan begin to scale the Bionis to enact justice on the Mechon, and along the way new allies are met, challenges are conquered, and the Monado's true purpose is eventually revealed. Okay, good setup. So, how is Xenoblade Chronicles? Well, regardless of what I or anyone else thinks, it did help repopularize the RPG by giving the genre some much needed tweaks. you're given a real sense of freedom in exploring the world, whereas most RPGs restrict your path and create invisible walls to prevent death outside of combat. This game, on the other hand, lets you go just about anywhere, as well as letting you leap off great heights, which can actually speed up exploration if the fall isn't too far down, which is rather fun. Other nifty features that improve the overall quality of life is being able to gain XP from completing side quests and discovering new locations on the map, not just killing enemies. Enemies themselves are much easily avoided compared to other genre games, and it's quite cool that higher level foes appear in lower level areas. I can imagine it'd be quite satisfying to return to fight them later. And even if you die in combat, you'll keep any XP gained during it and will respawn nearby. Oh, and you can also teleport to any found location whenever you like. It's the little things, but it really does help in making the game more fun and accessible, along with helping it stand out from other RPGs in a very good way. And the Definitive Edition adds even more helpful nuances to the gameplay, from a less intrusive AI, along with being able to mark side quests on the minimap. Speaking of the Definitive Edition, how is the updated presentation? Well, I'll confess that it wasn't until I saw some footage from the Wii version again that I realized that this is an impressive makeover. The game was one of the Wii's most visually striking titles, despite some muddy character models. The Switch version gives the cast a more anime look, which works, and it is still a pretty game, but the scope of these vistas was a little bit more impactful on a less powerful console. And there are certainly textures and animations, like in conversation scenes, where you can tell that this is a remaster. This is also a stupid thing to comment on, but still on the topic of the conversation scenes, I don't like the new Kingdom Heartsy font used as opposed to the other one, which fit the game a lot better. Look, I know I'm being overly critical, and part of this could stem from being a PlayStation gamer too, and seeing all the incredible work Bluepoint Games have done in making older games look on par with moderner titles, but the overall artistic design of this world is screaming for some glossier visuals. But like I said, I'm being a little critical. I think it might come from a place of having played Switch games over the course of the year that aren't realizing the full graphical potential of the hardware. A legit complaint though would be that playing in handheld mode doesn't do the graphics or the frame rate any favors. But Xenoblade still has its moments of in-game beauty, a fair few in fact, though that is partly due to the world of the Bionist being magnificently designed. Some of the imagery combined with the music is the type of enthralling fantasy I wish I could lose myself in. And oh god, I need to take a detour to talk about the soundtrack for this game. The few tracks I heard at the start of the game way back when stood out enough for me to listen to them regularly. It was that music that probably played a part in my regret over selling it. It's amazing, and with the Definitive Edition giving an orchestral boost to many of these tracks, perfection was improved upon. It's the kind of video game music that's instantly nostalgic and perfectly encapsulates the feelings brought on by the scenarios they accompany. And it's the main theme that makes the start screen one of my favourites in any game. O&M recommended that you don't do anything as soon as you boot the game up, and I have to agree. It's a beautiful scene that I've let play out in its entirety more than once. And the look of the locations themselves are incredible fantasy designs that... I don't even know how best to describe the thrill of navigating them, but simply running around Colony 9 as the sun set into night was the main thing that really stuck in my mind on the Wii, and getting to explore more of this world was a treat. I was riveted every time I entered a new locale. To me, that's what makes this game, getting to immerse yourself in the rich greenery of the Bionist and taking in the unique sights each area contains, and the openness of the exploration really helps that. The interiors aren't quite as engaging, I will admit, and there's parts like this one here where if the mandatory combat encounters get the best of you, repeating the same section over and over gets a bit tedious. But otherwise, I do like the intricate layers that some of these areas have. And speaking of the combat, I've spent so much time gushing over how much I love travelling across this world that I almost forgot to talk about the many adversaries you have to fight along the way. In the last decade, we got two RPGs that revived popularity within the genre. This and another little game called Ni no Kuni, i.e. one of my top 5 games of all time. One of the many things I love about it is how it threw standard turn-based combat out of the window in favour for frenetic fights that still felt true to the genre. Xenoblade does share similarities. You can freely move about the space and select moves on the go. It was the combat that put me off the game initially, but as I've already mentioned, the game now tells you when certain arts will deal critical damage, so with that improvement, how do I find it now? I think it's fine. There are some things that really irk me about it though, and I know I'll get a lot of hate for this, but there's times when it feels kind of sloppy and annoying. Shulk has these attacks that deal extra damage when you're in a certain position, behind or to the side of your enemy. But if your opponent is attacking you, they'll automatically face you even if you try running around them. Also, to beat the boss mechon, you need to inflict certain conditions onto them that you do via the arts. But by the time I get to the next mechon boss, I'd forget about that and would be stumped for the longest time until I remembered. But those are only quibbles. What ultimately frustrated me the most about the combat is the lack of a defend button. Again, comparing to Ni no Kuni, which is unfortunately unavoidable for me since I played that game first, you could defend yourself against attacks for just a moment, as well as having all of these items that could ail any conditions like poison, paralyze, the usual things. Here you have to suffer with these effects for however long, and having HP restoration delegated to an art that takes time to charge up means that you'll take a ton of damage before you get to heal yourself, only to lose it all a few seconds later because you can't avoid attacks. Distancing yourself from enemies won't help much either, because they'll damage you no matter how far you are from the attack. It can get very irritating, but when these things aren't too intrusive to progression, although maybe changing to casual mode partway through my playthrough helped, and yes, I put the game on casual, bite me, it still gets challenging anyway, the combat still manages to be pretty fun. Pulling off attacks is satisfying and occasionally thrilling, and like any good RPG, getting over a tough bit, and not just because of the aforementioned inconveniences, gives you a good triumphant feeling. I'm not a fan of this feature that gets introduced once the Monado gains more power though. See, in the story, the Monado gives Shulk visions of the future, allowing him to alter it to his advantage. An interesting plot device for sure, but they incorporate it into the combat by seeing attacks from your opponents before they happen, allowing you to plan a counterattack. A cool gimmick at first, but after a while it slows the momentum of the fighting down when you're constantly stopped to see the vision, and I found it got a bit annoying, especially when it happens multiple times in a single fight. But even so, there is some excitement to glean from these fights, even if they are what eventually turned me away from the game yet again. I didn't get to the end of this game. Sorry, I gave it a really good go, and I'll even admit that I do like the game to an extent, but a huge, lengthy experience like this requires a certain level of commitment from the player to get to the credits. A commitment which I just can't give to Xenoblade. Going back to Ni no Kuni, one of the things that kept the fighting interesting is that Oliver will learn additional spells as the game progresses, so there's always something new to tinker with beyond the different familiars and the other leads. You learn the odd new move here, and I'll admit to not really trying out the other characters much, but even though I did find the fighting fun, it was nowhere near gripping or varied enough that I was happy to spend hours grinding. And even with getting XP from finding new areas and completing side quests, leveling up is still pretty time consuming, and the combat is only something I find fun in bursts. I just can't see myself spending 50 plus hours doing battle after battle. But I suppose the other reason is that there came a point late into my playthrough that my mind began to wander during cutscenes. Yeah, as a reviewer always starts with the story first, I'm finally making the point that I wasn't that taken by the plot. It's fine, the leads are likable enough even if the company you keep gets a bit crowded. I just didn't care that much. I realized this during this scene where they're trying to save this recently introduced character and they're all doing that anime thing of yelling really dramatically, and I couldn't understand why they cared about this guy so much when they'd only known him for like a bit. I was gonna say hour, but given the in-game time, everyone probably spent a week scaling this place, or whatever you want to say. I don't know, I just found myself uninterested by the story after a while for no particular reason. I understood the motivations, the British voice cast is charming even if I'm not that intimidated by a giant robot with a Cockney accent.
I've been waiting for you, Monado boy.
What? It spoke!
Yeah, I just wanted to see if you fancy nipping down the pub for a quick King Lear. I just found myself antsy whenever we got to a big dollop of action or exposition which didn't bring much room for engaging character moments. I guess that's what the heart-to-hearts are for, but it would have been nice to have some of them actually been accessible when I came across them. On that note, there are plenty of extra things to discover like ether crystals and outfits for your character, but it's more there for people who take note of all the subtle effects different clothing and items have on the combat, and I'm not one of those people. I'd like to point out that even though I haven't finished this game, I don't think I've outright given up on it. I imagine I'll still pop the card into my Switch to slowly chip away at the story mode, if nothing else just to see more exotic locations. In that respect, it's a bit like Pokemon. I'm not always enraptured by the combat, but I get through it to discover more of a very intriguing map. This is a solid game, there's a lot I enjoy about it, but it's one that I never see anyone talk about as anything other than a masterpiece. Which I just can't see for myself. Always. There's the odd moment when I'm just traversing around where I understand the hype. I get swept up until I come across the main bulk of the game. It's frustrating to me because there are things here that have me genuinely spellbound, but others that leave me less enthused. Part of me wishes I'd endured through the Wii version because despite the improvements made here, I'd probably have some fond nostalgia for it. If you couldn't tell, there's few games that I wished I loved as much as this one because so much of it is right up my alley, but in the end, I don't, and that's a real shame.